Hello and welcome. Human Synergistics first roundtable event. Happy to kick this off and expecting people to start popping in any moment. Thank you to those who joined. Hello, Karina. Welcome. So we are just kicking things off. So I think the people will start popping in. We have 3 hours of open time to discuss culture and leadership and any questions people have. And thankfully, I also have some very interesting new developments from Human Synergistics to share, some exciting new things that are coming out this year and available now. So you'll hear it first. Here. Karina, I think I can see when you type into the chat. So if you have any immediate questions, any topics you'd like me to start with, please feel free. Since you're the first one, hi, good afternoon. Since you're the first to, please feel free to add your questions. And actually that goes for everyone. Happy to take questions. Fair enough. Well, we are recording this as well. So to anyone who's watching and to those who see this in the future, I think I can actually start showing you some of the new insights and information that we have, and we can build from there. So I thought it might be fun to start with one of the brand new developments that we have from Human Synergistics, and that is our new LSI Plus report. So you may have heard about this. It's been launched very, very recently by Human Synergistics. We have the ability to provide the new, hello, Julia, welcome. Hey. If you have any questions at any time, please type them into the comments. I can't hear you, but I can see the questions. And if you'd like to join me on stage here in the video so that we can chat, please just write that as well, and happy to have you in. So we just kicked this off. This is our first ever roundtable event. We did this new idea to try to reach a broader audience, to try to be more accessible and share a little bit of our learnings and new insights and so on. So I was going to kick things off with something that a lot of people are really excited about. We've had a few of our clients and quite a few of our accredited practitioners beginning to test our new LSI Plus report. So very, very popular tool, been around for over 50 years. And this year we've added quite a bit to that instrument and pretty excited about it. So if anyone has any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll actually pull up an example of the report so you can see what we get when we receive the new LSI Plus report. So I won't go through everything because I'm assuming some of you are accredited in the tool and familiar. So I will primarily focus on what's new in the report. So this really isn't an accreditation session or a report debrief kind of content. We're really here at this point to try to talk about what's new in the LSI Plus report, how that can be helpful and how that can be used. Mr. Nick, okay. So assuming that you're familiar with the LSI, you actually see a nice new cover. So the LSI, by the way, the LSI Plus is, again, additional new content, and it is optional. So you can continue to use and receive the LSI reports as you're familiar with them, or you can also ask for the additional content. At this time, we're providing the LSI Plus at no additional charge, so you can test it out as an accredited practitioner with your clients and see how the experience is. And of course, we're very interested in your feedback on how you enjoy the new report content. Or if you would like that LSI Plus, there in the future, there will be a cost associated with that additional information. But again, now we're offering this at no cost. So please feel free to reach out and ask for this. Okay. So the cover looks a little bit different. We're mentioning the fact, of course, that we have the LSI Plus and new insights. This does, by the way, make the report quite a bit longer than you may be familiar with. As usual, we start off with our table of contents. Again, I really won't go into any of the standard content in the report. LSI jumps right into the self-description profile on page 3, just as we've seen that before. The new content really starts right after that self-description profile, and this is some of it now. So what we're looking at is what's called the self-perceptions summary. So this is a text description, and this is customized based on the profile of the focal participant. So every profile, the system goes through a process. We talk about what that is exactly in the accreditation, but to identify primary patterns within the self-description profile. And then the report is really describing how that profile plays out. What are the primary characteristics of it? It always starts off, maybe a little small to see, but with a list of potential strengths, potential counterproductive tendencies, and about a page and a half of text. Again, this is customized based on the profile, but typically about a page and a half of text to describe how that profile likely plays out. I think this is really, really helpful. The feedback I've received thus far is that this is, especially for people who are new to human synergistics tools or newly accredited, that this is particularly helpful to kind of understand and get some terminology and some color in terms of what is this profile telling us. So that's the first piece of, I'll go back one page. That's the first piece of new content, just a brief summary of that self-description profile and what that's telling us. Okay. Then we get the next section of new content, and this is titled Self-Perceptions, a Closer Look. So this is really exciting. What we're really doing here is, again, the feedback here is customized based on the unique profile to the individual. And we are taking this one step further in terms of not just describing that profile, but describing how that profile likely plays out and has a consequence and effect primarily on the well-being and productivity of the focal participant. So this is really making that connection between, not only what are we seeing in these patterns in the profile, but how are those likely affecting the individual, their ability to work effectively, and so on and so forth. So this is actually broken up into 2 sections. The first is the impact that this may have on task accomplishment, my ability to get things done, achieve goals, and so on. And the second section of this is labeled impact on teamwork. So again, how these patterns influence my ability, the focal participant's ability to work effectively with others, lead teams, and so on. So I think I forgot to mention, and I really should, that the LSI Plus is based on designed for people in leadership positions. So while the LSI, again, is normed and designed really for anyone, the LSI Plus text is focused on the assumption that this individual is in a leadership position and leads other people within an organization. So again, if you are accredited in LSI and are working with someone in a leadership role, this might be very interesting for you. Okay, so once we understand that profile, not only what it is, but sort of how it plays out, then we can move a little bit further into the report. This also ends in a nice section on insights from research. So I find these to be very, very interesting. The next section is the standard item level feedback. So I'll skip through this as, again, that's a standard part of the report you should be familiar with. Then, of course, we move from the self-description profile sort of one step further in the model of LSI to the feedback profile. Again, this is standard in terms of what you've seen previously from LSI. And then again, right after the profile and statistics, you get a new section described as others' perceptions summary. So this is a description, keeping in mind that the profile that we just looked at is feedback from others in terms of how they perceive the behavior of the focal participant. And this section is describing what those people are really seeing, what those patterns are. Again, giving some language and some terminology and a nice description of what is that profile, how does that likely play out. Again, helping to really explain this and helping people to connect with it. Once we understand that feedback profile, then again, we're going a step further and looking at the other's perceptions, a closer look. And much like the self-description content, again, we're going one step further here and looking at not only those patterns in the current behavioral profile, but how those patterns are affecting the focal participant's ability, really in two broad areas. Again, the first, primarily task accomplishment. Excuse me, turn the page too quickly. How my behavior enables or perhaps hinders my ability to get work done, make decisions, work towards goals, be effective in task-oriented activities. And then secondarily in the report, a little later on, you'll see the impact that these patterns have on teamwork. So again, all of the text here is customized based on the unique profile of the individual. So the text will be different from report to report. And I find that to be tremendously helpful. We're really describing not only what we're seeing in these patterns, but how that's going to play out in terms of my ability to lead other people effectively, communicate, make decisions, and so on. So I think very, very helpful information. Without this, we're using correlations and other methods to try to help people to understand the relationship between these patterns and performance. I think it's very nice here to have some text that really describes how that plays out. Okay. Good. Then this switches to the item level feedback, which again is a standard part of our LSI reports. So I will skip through that content that you're already familiar with. Self versus feedback comparison, statistics, spread of opinion. All of this is standard in the report. Johari's windows and key. And then we get into, again, toward the end of the report. Oh, I'm sorry. Nope, this is standard. Breakouts. Lost in my own report. Standard part of LSI reports for our office typically is to include breakouts so that we can look at feedback not only overall, but across different subgroups and categories. That's standard as well, as are the outcome sections of the report. But toward the very end here, we get, again, new content. Finally, toward the end, we have specific suggestions for development. In many ways, I think this might be the most helpful content of the new LSI Plus. And again, this is customized based on the profile. So this is unique to the individual and gives them quite a few. So we have a whole category here of project leadership, recommendations of things the participant could do differently, aspects of team leadership they may be able to do differently, so on and so forth. How do we give feedback and coaching, communication. So you can see there are quite a few of these sections. I always suggest in this case, of course, that we pick just a few of these things to work on and to develop. I like the fact that we're giving you, several pages of recommendations for development, and that really, I think, will help us to, the participant to be able to find something within that list that they feel that they can do, they can act on, they can begin incorporating into their day-to-day work, and then, building from there. So I don't think I mentioned this, or I'm going to back up just slightly, but there are two sections of this suggestion for development. The first section is actually based on the self-description profile. And secondarily, a few pages later, should get, there we go, suggestions for development based on the feedback profile. So happy to get into this if people have questions about it. It's a topic that we discuss quite in depth in our accreditations, but depending on the purpose of why we are using the LSI, we may be focusing on one section of the report more heavily than the other, meaning we may be focusing primarily on the self-description for this purpose, or we may be focusing primarily on feedback. So we have a separate suggestions for development content for each of those profiles, again, because in many cases you will find differences. So if we're focusing on feedback profiles, then again, we have several suggestions for development here. Again, any and all of those are available for the participant. Of course, you can use your own development steps and suggestions, but I like the fact that we are kind of proactively trying to provide more content that will help the participant and also perhaps you, the coach, to identify clear action steps that the participant can begin to incorporate and act on. So I think that's very, very helpful. And that actually is the end of the report, quite a few pages longer than you may be familiar with. With all of that nice new text. But I think, again, I think it's going to be something that's really going to be helpful. Encourage any of you to try that out while we're still continuing to offer the LSI Plus content at no additional cost. See how that works for you and your people. I'll pause here for a moment and see if there are any questions about the LSI Plus report. That content and material, or really anything about LSI, since we have a sample report here, it's easy enough to jump into it as needed. Any questions, just type them into the comments, and happy to help. Otherwise, in a few minutes, I'll mosey on to the next topic. All right. So that was our new LSI Plus report. I hope you find that helpful and useful moving forward. All right, then, without any questions, I'll jump to the next topic that I'm really happy and excited to discuss from Human Synergistics, and that is the new AI, artificial intelligence report for the OCI. So this is actually not an entire report. This is an additional section of content, so that when you, if you do OCI culture measurement projects with Human Synergistics, using not only OCI, but also our OEI, you can receive the new artificial intelligence driven report. So this is something that we've been working on for a number of years. This is not a chat GPT or a picture making AI. This is a statistical AI developed by Dr. Cook and Dr. Zumal and I believe Dr. Boglarski in the US. And we have tested this and are beta testing it with our clients now in Europe. So I'll pull up an example of what we get when we use and create the new artificial intelligence report for OCI. Okay, so this is provided in a PowerPoint format. So you may know if you have done culture projects with us previously, the reports are typically delivered really both in PDF forms, and you can also get those in PowerPoint forms. This report we create exclusively at this point in a PowerPoint format. It's really just a few pages, but that's what we need. It's really about trying to give the client some clarity and specificity on what we need to work on. You know, what are the areas that we need to focus on for development. To be honest with you, this is something that has been requested for a number of years. I can't tell you how many times once clients receive our reports, the question oftentimes comes back of, just give me the top 3 things that we need to shift in our climate or in terms of leadership to drive our culture in the direction that we're hoping to move. And while that's possible with the data, that's something I think we always need to be a little bit careful with. Boiling things down a little too quickly may cause us to overlook opportunities that we have, and every journey and every organization really is different. But I do like the fact that we have this to give additional information and insights on where we might want to focus. So let me show you how this works. First of all, get rid of that. Okay. So this starts off with the client's overall data. So this, if you're accredited and familiar with our tools, this is our How Culture Works model, the detailed version of this, where we're showing on the far left, of course, the client's own ideal or preferred culture that they've described for themselves. Next, we're looking at all of the 31 climate factors that we assess. Third step in the model is the current operating culture of the organization. And the fourth section on the far right-hand side are the outcomes of those aspects of well-being and performance at individual, team, and organizational levels. So this is, something that, of course, the client receives typically in our reports, very much in the beginning. I love this page because it gives us a very nice high-level perspective of the organization system, what's playing out, how that's affecting our people, driving performance, and so on. So I won't go into the model unless we have questions about how culture works. I'm assuming you're somewhat familiar with this. The point here is that, if these are our results and we're hoping to shift that current culture toward the ideal, trying to focus on which climate factors we address is something we talk about in accreditation. There are a variety of ways to identify which factors we want to leverage, but this AI report gives us a new way. So what the system is essentially doing, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. Somebody might let me know if you can see that as I hover it over. That might be helpful. Um, what we're doing is taking the data from the client and then again adding this into or feeding this into the new AI. And what it's doing is looking at the statistical relationships between these different factors in the organization's system. So it's looking at patterns between culture and outcomes, and correlations and patterns between climate and culture. Much of this information you do see in the standard PDF reports toward the end in the appendix. Some of my favorite stuff is way back there in the back of the reports. But this system actually goes quite a bit further, digging into some data that's maybe not apparent, and really finding the strongest relationships between those sections of the reports. Something many of our consultants call the red thread, right? So if we want to drive things like employee engagement, and that needs to improve as an outcome, then which culture styles need to shift and which climate factors need to be developed in order to do that. So it's very much the debriefing process of our reports. And again, the way this typically starts is by identifying the performance or well-being criteria that we primarily want to address. So again, the organizational culture inventory measures several outcomes across individual team and organizational level, everything from employee satisfaction and motivation to the ability of teams to collaborate cohesively, adaptability of the organization, and so on. Of course, those outcome criteria can also be customized, but the point here is that once we have identified which of those KPIs we really want to improve, the system will then complete the rest of the steps to identify. So if you can see in the graphic, this client has chosen to address the top two outcome items. These are those with the lowest scores in their organization. This is a departmental level quality and role clarity. So if those are the things that we want to improve in terms of the organization's performance, then what needs to change otherwise? So we can already see on the right-hand side, the system has identified the three styles within this organization's culture that are most strongly correlated and associated and really driving those outcomes of role clarity and quality. So those three styles on the right-hand side are self-actualizing, avoidance, and affiliative behavior. So again, this is actually the client's profile. We can see that in that profile on the slide. You can see that the system has, the AI has identified those. We've blocked off the ones that it's identified. To be honest with you, those would be likely targets for development. In terms of the constructive blue patterns, those are the two weakest of the constructive styles, which are likely candidates for development in most cases. Avoidance is also the strongest of the defensive styles, also a likely candidate for development. So it's nice to see the parallels that we're finding in here from the AI, but good. So those are the three styles that we want to address. Then what climate factors do we need to address? So now we have all three sections of the model here. Our climate, or as we're describing here, the levers for change on the left, which is driving and influencing our current culture. And that culture is primarily driving and is responsible for what we are seeing in aspects of our departmental level quality and role clarity. So if we want those outcomes to improve, we need to develop primarily those three patterns within the organization's culture. And based on this organization's data and structures, we can identify, or the system can identify, the three climate factors that we see on the left-hand side as being most important and critical to shift that culture. These are things like customer service focus, employee involvement, and downward communication. Right. The system will also do this for each of the individual outcome questions. So in this case, if we just isolate departmental level quality alone as the factor we want to develop, then we are seeing the two styles that are driving that most positively and or negatively. And then third, we are getting the three climate factors that we need to shift. Again, customer service focus, employee involvement, downward communication in order to drive those culture styles in the direction that we would like. And here's the second example of role clarity. Also includes a little worksheet, just kind of a simple exercise so that people can think through these targets, how we're going to shift these things, and particularly how we're going to leverage and influence the levers for change. By the way, common question when clients get to the point of, all right, we've identified, these three factors that we want to develop. How do we best do that? There's a lot of case studies, thankfully, throughout our history that demonstrate how those factors are changed. But I will say also that our office in Australia has a wonderful series of podcasts. If you're not familiar, they're called Culture Bites. And they did recently, excuse me, a series of those Culture Bite episodes on the 31 climate factors in organizations. And not only what they are, but I think most helpfully, how we leverage those things, how we shift them in organizations. And that's wonderful content. So if you're not aware of the Culture Bites podcast, I can't recommend it enough. All right. So what is this AI report helpful for at the end of the day? First of all, it helps to answer the question of now what. I do find occasionally that clients can be a bit overwhelmed by the amount of information that is in, especially our standard complete reports. And I think it is very helpful to be able to give them a little bit of focus in terms of clarity on where they need to put their efforts. So I think that's a very helpful thing. The next is it's a learning tool, I think, for consultants and clients as well. For people who go through accreditation with us, we spend a lot of time talking about how to identify climate factors and how to leverage those to create change. So with that context, this is really just another level to help guide us forward. I think many times what you'll find when, especially those of you who are experienced, I know Jochen is here, so those of you who are experienced in using these tools will probably find that the AI is coming up with recommendations that you would have focused on as well. But I think that's helpful. It's a little confirmatory, shows us that we had the right idea, and can be quite helpful in that way. Good. Yep. It helps to introduce and jumpstart action planning, gives the client focus very quickly on where they can create change. It helps to validate recommendations. Sometimes organizations may push back a little bit on these recommendations in terms of why do we need to work on communication? Why do we think, feedback is the thing that needs to shift? Here, it gives us one more good reason to justify developing those areas. And the last point around the fact that this is an alternative, objective perspective of what needs to shift and change in the organization. I think that's helpful as well. So I believe that is the report. So you get again, all of this information in a nice PowerPoint format, all of customized based on your own client data. So this is something that is available now. If you or your clients are conducting culture projects with us and would like to see the AI report for their data sets, happy to provide that. Might take us a few extra days to score that for you, but we can create it. So very, very happy that this is coming out, and look forward to using it with more clients. Good. Any questions about the AI report? What that's telling us, how that's helpful? Right. Well, if anything comes up, please let me know. I think that's a good thing. All right. Very good. So that's topic 2. We've talked about the new LSI Plus report. Again, something that I think is very exciting for our coaches. People use LSI for decades. You've got something very new and exciting to share, and I think a lot of helpful insights in that additional text. Of course, also this year, we are launching and offering our new AI report content for OCI culture projects. And very happy to be able to offer that as well. Let me take a little 30-second break just to see if there are questions. Give you the opportunity to contribute. If there's anyone who has a question, just please type that into the chat, and I should be able to see that. And if anyone would like to have a discussion about culture, leadership, these tools, or anything at all, please just let me know, and I should be able to allow you to join the stage with me, and then we can just chat directly on those topics. Right. Very good. Then, if we don't have any questions, I'm happy to move on to the next topic. Thankfully, I came prepared. All right. While we're on the topic of organizational culture, I thought I might include a presentation that I've done, I think, just once before. So maybe this will be new to quite a few of you. This is a presentation I created to try to introduce the Human Synergistics How Culture Works model in as brief a way as possible. So this is a presentation that I call the 4Ds to describe that structure and model that we use to measure and develop culture. All right. So the 4Ds stand for define, design, do, and deliver. So, and these, of course, then form a causal structure. And we can really think about this broadly. It kind of applies to most project planning and things we want to do. The first step is to define what are we trying to do? What's the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? We design, we plan how we're going to get there, how we can achieve that. We then hopefully take action, attempt to do this, and then this results in some kind of a deliverable or outcome. So that kind of causal structure is essentially what we're measuring as well in our How Culture Works model. So in the very beginning of that model, we are talking about defining, and in this case, what we're defining really are the values. What do we want in this organization? What should be taking place? What is appropriate? What will help us move forward and perform at our best? What is consistent with our values? So defining those values of what this organization is all about, I think, is very much the first step in not only in the model, but very much the first step for clients as well. When we work with organizations to develop culture, I very much try to encourage them to focus on measuring the ideal state first, get very clear on where we are going, what we need from our people. Again, what is going to help us perform at our best, what is consistent with our values and purpose, and to not only understand that, but have a picture of that, a snapshot of that, so that we can then compare this to the current state later. In any case, first step is defining our values. What are we all about? What should be taking place? What do we want? All right. Then the next step is to design. And in this case, we're talking about organizational climate, not yet culture. This is organizational climate. Climate refers to essentially the systems and structures of the organization that ultimately influence organizational and drive organizational culture. So think of things like systems around feedback, reward and punishment, distribution of authority in the organization, how goals are set, how jobs are designed, those structural aspects of the organization system. Those structures then, as we know, have an influence on how people behave, respond, and complete their work within that organization. So this is driving then what we actually do in the current state. This brings us to the third step, where we are measuring current operating culture in the organization. And this, of course, drives the last section of the model, which we describe as what we deliver. And we describe these in our instruments as being outcomes. Again, these are typically across two broad categories: performance criteria along the lines of things like, safety, ability to service customers, productivity, and so on, efficiency, as well as aspects of well-being, employee motivation, satisfaction, engagement, psychological safety, and so on. So this is the 4Ds of the How Culture Works model. Hopefully that's a nice, quick way to introduce the concept. But We'll go a little bit further because of course, there's more. Again, not only are those the four sections that we're measuring with these instruments, but they then create a causal structure within the organization so that we hopefully can understand how our values influence our systems, and systems drive our culture, and our culture is responsible and explains what we're seeing in our overall performance, effectiveness, as well as the well-being of our members. Right. So then this transitions into part two of this, where we start talking about the characteristics of each of those sections of the model. I find that both of these concepts are really important, I think, for leaders and, of course, our accredited community to have clear in our minds, not only those four separate sections of our model, or the How Culture Works model, but how we describe those in terms of the characteristics of each of those stages. So I sort of think of this as the kind of the vertical dimension of each of these. There is, to some extent, a positive versus a negative dimension within each step. So let me try to explain that. When we think about outcomes, I think we can use the language of effective versus ineffective. When we think about what we're measuring in that area, again, measurements of well-being and effectiveness. So if we are serving customers effectively, if we are solving problems, if we are satisfied and engaged, that's a good sign of effectiveness. It's not effective for your people to be in conflict with one another, to be burning out, having high turnover rates in your organization. Those are not effective. So I think we can think about outcome criteria very much in terms of, is this effective or ineffective for our people in business? By the way, most leaders and organizations are very clear on their KPIs and what defines their performance and effectiveness. The challenge is understanding exactly where that's coming from. Okay. Once we so effective versus ineffective, when we move backwards in the model and start talking about culture, effective versus ineffective is not the terminology that is really most helpful. Really, when we think about behavioral patterns and organizational culture, the terminology we use and focus on in our models has to do with satisfaction versus security orientation. So this is referencing the psychological background of these instruments and this model, and also in terms of what culture is, in terms of the psychological understanding and belief of your employees about how they best approach their work and work with one another. So happy to talk about our circumplex separately, but the vertical dimension of that model is referring to psychologically satisfaction oriented versus a lower part of the model, security oriented patterns. Again, referencing very much concepts like Abraham Maslow, Harry Stack Sullivan's concepts around satisfaction versus security. So good. And of course, in the ideal on the very left-hand side, the ideal description, that circumplex again is also describing those patterns in terms of satisfaction versus security. When we take a look at climate, then we need another set of terminology. Effective and ineffective isn't really the most helpful, and satisfaction versus security orientation is also not really appropriate here. In this case, what we're really looking at is the extent to which these climate factors are either facilitating or inhibiting in their nature. Literally meaning that facilitating climate factors facilitate, enable, and support and guide employees in terms of what behavior we do want from you, how you should, what is good work, how we want our people working together, and so on, versus inhibiting climate factors, which are essentially preventing constructive behavior and ultimately encouraging more defensive, security-oriented patterns. So that's the second sort of step, I think, in understanding the How Culture Works model. Not only what are those four separate sections and how are they different from one another, culture versus climate versus outcomes, for example, and secondarily, what are the characteristics of each of those factors so that we can understand them better, and I'll illustrate that next. Typically, what we find is that when we have highly satisfaction-oriented, constructive values, that those values should influence the way we design our organization. These are the blue arrows toward the top there. If we want in our values in the very left hand side, we say we want goal orientation and creativity from our people that we recognize we value and want. Then we need to design the organization, design jobs, goals, and communicate and define our values in a way that enables and facilitates that creative goal-oriented behavior. And if we create an organization system, including leadership, role modeling, and facilitating that kind of constructive behavior, then we will see that behavior in our current culture. We will have people working towards goals, being creative and adaptive in their work, and the extent to which that takes place will tend to drive positive outcomes where people report that they are more engaged and motivated. And we do, in fact, find creative solutions to problems and, in fact, more adaptive as an organization. The extent to which perhaps values may be security oriented or more frequently the case, unfortunately, and I'll talk about this a little later, there are often gaps between values and climate. The typical disconnect in this system exists between values, which are typically quite positive in terms of satisfaction orientation and the way we design our organization. So unfortunately, too often we see that businesses do say that they want creativity and goal-oriented behavior, but they design a system, they role model behaviors in a way that inhibits that kind of goal orientation and creativity in the climate. Therefore, when we look at the organization's culture, people are not working towards goals and as creative as they could be. And when we finally get to the last step of the model, we find that our outcomes are less effective. Again, people reporting that they're less engaged and motivated and less adaptive in their work. All right. So the theory is lovely, but it's also nice to see this in reality. So the next piece is actually looking at a couple examples of client data and profiles. So these are our actual clients of ours. This organization has gone through a few years of development, and we're seeing really what we'd like to see. We're seeing very, very constructive culture in the current state, which is very consistent with their ideal description. And I know it's probably a little too small to see, but if we look on the very right-hand side in terms of the outcomes, these are all scoring above average. So we are seeing people reporting that they are highly satisfied, motivated, and tend to stay with the organization. Teams are describing that they are able to collaborate and are cohesive within as well as across work groups. The organization is serving its customers effectively and is adaptive as an organization. So what we're seeing on the right-hand side is a high-performing, or in other words, highly effective organization. Where is that coming? I think I have a click. Yeah, so we're seeing an effective organization in terms of outcomes. Why are we seeing such positive outcomes? Why are people so motivated, engaged, and satisfied? That is because the organization's current operating culture is primarily satisfaction oriented. Again, those are the patterns that promote positive outcomes in people. And so we're seeing that relationship here as well. Lovely current operating culture, almost identical to the ideal. How did they manage to do that? Well, if we take one step back and look at the climate factors, again, they're probably a little too small to see, but the vast majority of those are quite positive. We're scoring above average. By the way, the little tick marks, the check marks, are those climate factors that are structured in primarily facilitating ways. If you see any little downward triangles, those are climate factors that are primarily currently inhibiting in their structure and thereby would be detracting from constructive behavior and encouraging defensive. In this case, we're seeing the vast majority of those climate factors are positive and quite strongly positive. And this is the reason that people are enabled and encouraged to behave in those constructive ways. That is not only driving high performance across the organization, but is also consistent with our values in the first place in terms of what we said should be taking place. This is very much what we want to see in terms of a high-performing organization as a result of a highly and effectively designed organizational system. All right, but let's see another example. This is again another anonymized client profile data set. and we are looking at more what we see typically when we begin working with organizations. So we still have that lovely constructive ideal culture on the left-hand side, but we're not seeing that play out to the extent that we would like in the current culture, right? Much less blue patterns, and there's much more of those red and green patterns. If we look on the far right-hand side, again, it's probably a little too small, but you'll see many little downward triangles, and those are illustrating the feedback from our employees is reporting that we are less motivated than we typically see in organizations, less satisfied, less likely to stay with the organization. So we measure aspects of things like employee commitment, turnover. In any case, what we're broadly seeing here, unfortunately, is some fairly ineffective KPIs and deliverables at the end of the day. Where is that coming from? Why is this happening? Well, we can answer that. Right, one step back in the model, we can see that the organization's current culture, while it does include constructive patterns, is primarily security oriented. The majority of those patterns are in the security oriented section of the model. And that is the reason that primarily we are seeing the negative scores in our outcomes and performance and well-being. If we want to understand why that current culture is so defensive, especially when we describe something else as being our ideal, then we can understand that as well when we take one step back and look at the climate factors. Again, we are far too frequently, we have designed the organization system in a way that is far too inhibiting and too frequently, which makes it more difficult for people to exercise constructive behavior and ultimately encourages more defensive norms, which again costs our organization at the end of the day in both the well-being of our people and their ability to perform at their best. So while this is the disconnect I was mentioning previously, this is not uncommon. To be honest with you, there is always a bit of a gap between current behavior and ideal behavior, and we see that at not only every level of our tools, but I like to use that as a silly example that hopefully connects. If I think about something like how my eating habits should be versus how my eating habits currently are, there's a little gap there. I know pretty clearly what I should be doing. My current behavior might be a bit further from that. So understanding that gap is very important. And so in organizations, again, it's very, very helpful to not only be able to measure that ideal, but then understand where is the disconnect that's encouraging behavior that's inconsistent with our values and counterproductive in terms of our performance. And as you can see here, that disconnect, again, consistently takes place in the organization's climate. Again, we want creativity, but we have designed jobs and set goals and so on in a way that prevents creative behavior, inhibits that in our people. And so systemically, as a pattern, we see people behaving in less creative and adaptive ways in the current culture in terms of what they do. And that is costing them and the organization broadly in terms of performance at the end of the day. All right. So I believe that is the complete presentation of the 4Ds. Not quite as short as perhaps it should have been, but in any case, a couple of key concepts. What are those 4 sections of the How Culture Works model? What are the differences between them in terms of outcomes versus culture versus climate and so on? Secondarily, how do we understand those in terms of their characteristics? Outcomes we can think of as effective or ineffective, culture and pattern and psychological patterns in terms of security orientation versus satisfaction orientation. And again, moving backwards into climate, understanding that in terms of what we are facilitating, encouraging, and enabling through the system design versus what we are in the extent to which the system is inhibiting those behaviors. All right. Hope that is helpful. If anyone would like any of these presentations, please feel free just to drop a note in the chat. Happy to upload these to Hightail platform and share that as well. Questions about the 4Ds or the How Culture Works model or any of these unusual concepts? Very good. I'm sorry, I think I have, maybe I do. Okay, no, good. All right, so that was my little discussion on the How Culture Works model. Hopefully that's helpful. Again, if anyone would like those presentations, anything like that, just let me know. All right, let's see where we are in terms of timing. We've got another 10 minutes. I thought we would take a break. I'm here for 3 hours to chat about again any questions people have, any topics you would like to discuss. Um, Otherwise, I'll try to share with you as much new information and helpful insights as possible. I thought we would logically take a break, maybe 10 minutes each hour, just to allow everyone to have catch a little air and refresh their tea. All right. Maybe before we do that, though, I can find. Oh, very good. We have a request for the presentations. I'm very happy to do that. All right, so this won't take too long, I think. Let's try this one. So, excuse me, let me fight with my technology for one moment. Here. So these are just a few PowerPoints. This will just take a few minutes. Yeah, great question from Jochen with regard to the artificial intelligence report for the OCI and OEI. No, it is not a standard part of the report. It is a separate addendum, if you will, that we send separately as PowerPoint format. So you have to request it, but I'm happy to provide that. And the artificial intelligence report is, again, like the LSI Plus, something that we have just recently launched and are providing to our clients for a period of time as a trial. So you can get this AI report. You can also get the LSI Plus content at this time at no additional cost. So for any of you who are doing projects with those tools, I'd encourage you to take us up on that opportunity to have that new information. All right. Okay. Sorry, just reading notes, making sure I haven't missed anyone's questions. Good old multitasking. All right. So a common question that we have is really, what is the project process? So there are really a couple of steps involved in terms of not only how do we conduct projects with clients, especially at the culture level, but how that's then implemented in the organization to create change. So this is a very high level perspective. The purpose of these slides is primarily to describe and illustrate how we work with our accredited network to support clients in order to collect data and generate reports and conduct these kinds of culture measurement projects. So what you're looking at are the 9 steps that we talk about within our office in terms of how we think of and structure the journey that we are on when we work with our clients. The green box below is giving you some specificity about the first 3 steps. So I hope that's not too confusing. So the 9 steps at the top, those break down into 3 sort of subcategories. The first 3 are kind of outlined in green. Those are the steps that take place really leading up to a culture measurement kind of project. The central 3 arrows are outlined in blue, and those are the steps that Human Synergistics conducts in terms of, again, how we build projects, gather data, generate reports, and such. The final 3 steps outlined in purple are the steps really after we've delivered reports. This has to do primarily with how those reports are debriefed, how we interpret that information, prioritize our targets, debrief this to leaders, build action plans, and then create change. So the first slide is really focusing on those first 3 steps. And then again, below that, we've got some detail in terms of what we're trying to accomplish during those 3 steps. So in the very beginning, this is really where we're getting into contact with the client organization, either directly because they've reached out to Human Synergistics, or through our network, more often through our network of accredited practitioners. Once we're in contact with the client, the main question I'm focused on is, what is the goal? What is the burning platform? Why are we interested in organizational culture? And you'll see below in those 5 green arrows, why is the first question in there. These are kind of the things we want to know. Why are we doing this? When are we doing this, right? Start thinking about timelines. Who is taking part? This is referring to sampling. So, who might be describing the ideal state or preferred culture, whom within our organization is going to take part in the current, these kinds of sampling questions, essentially, and so on. So once we have a purpose in terms of why we're doing this and a concept of really which instrument or instruments are going to be most helpful for organizations, then we're taking the next steps of beginning to build projects. So I won't get into too much detail here. This is part of really accreditation, but this is where we are customizing the project to focus on the KPIs and outcomes that the organization needs and wants to shift. Considering things like the languages that we need to use in the project, customizing invitations, and all of those good things. Once we have the structure decided, then we really are beginning to transfer into those central 3 steps. And these are the stages that Human Synergistics, our office, conducts. This is firstly project build. The process of building the project, creating unique websites, customizing those, importing your people, editing your languages, all of those customizations, as well as testing the project itself. The next step in the project process is data collection. So by the way, we typically build and test projects within 5 days. So that's a fairly quick process to get that built up and ready for testing. Once the testing is successful and we're ready to launch, then we can send out the inventory. So again, we measure organizational culture primarily through surveys. We have those both in digital as well as paper formats. This project process, I'm really going to focus on the digital process, but if you do have a need for paper, and there are some great benefits to using paper surveys in organizational culture measurement, happy to talk about that. There's some real advantages to that, but in any case, if we're assuming an online project, then we would be sending out email invitations to participants, and then that enters into the run phase of the project. Again, this is all done and conducted by Human Synergistics and wonderful people in my office like Nick and Nicholas, who build and conduct these projects and help our clients through this process quite smoothly and comfortably. So we take all of this work off your hands. We remind participants and check in and make sure the data is coming in and all of those good things. By the way, the run phase of the project, how long that takes, depends on a few factors. I usually recommend 4 weeks. To be honest with you, a lot of our clients do this in 3. But it depends on a few variables. One of those things, by the way, is things like the size of the organization, right? If your company is 100 people, a lot of times you can get away with a shorter timeline than when you're conducting a global project with 30,000 people, obviously. So anyway, that's the run phase of the project. Once we have enough data in order to, for example, ensure that the reports are statistically reliable and valid, and also we have all the kind of subgroups that you would like to have within your report, and then we can close the project and begin scoring that data. So that's ending the second stage here and moving into the third stage of the middle 3. Hopefully this is clear. 6th step, I guess. So we close the projects and then begin scoring. Just for your reference, scoring typically takes 5 days. So in 5 days or less, you will have all of the reports. And that would include not only the overall reports, subgroups, PowerPoints, but also artificial intelligence reports and support material. So all of that is delivered within 5 days of closing the project. And that is what we lovingly call the in-hand date. I don't know if you can see that on the model, but there's the in-hand date, and that is the date we always focus on in terms of that is our target for delivering reports and data and all of this content to the accredited practitioner in hand. Once that is in your hands, then it's out of ours. So then the development process really should begin. The next step you're seeing, this is sort of step 7, is the really reviewing the content of the reports. Again, the reports are delivered to accredited practitioners, people who have gone through the training and accreditation certification by Human Synergistics to be able to, receive those reports. And that is legitimate because it is key and important that you understand really what you're looking at, what this information is telling you, how to prioritize this, and so on. So there is a period in which those people are really reviewing that data before we get to the next stage, which is debriefing this. So again, culture reports can be several hundreds of pages. That is not the kind of content you want to deliver to senior leadership teams. Typically, you're going to want to boil this down to the key factors. What are the KPI? Much like you previously saw in the artificial intelligence report, right? What are the key outcomes, performance criteria, well-being, engagement that we want to shift? What culture patterns are most strongly driving that outcome, and which climate factors should we address? So, helping to boil this down, create clarity for the client organization, and again, debriefing that process. By the way, there are all sorts of ways, of course, to debrief this content. I've done this as well many times in collaboration with our accredited network. And I do have an example of a template of kind of a process that I prefer in terms of debriefing, introducing leadership teams to these models, and beginning to debrief their high-level feedback. So I think sometime in our live stream today, we'll have time to look at that. Good. But once we debrief this and we get transfer some knowledge and clarity and information to senior leaders and also people in HR and OD and those decision makers and people who are key to drive and create change in the organization. And we have a tremendous amount of content support material on this. So if you have any questions on how this is best done, please reach out. But once we've transferred that information and aligned in terms of what needs to change, then we're entering the 8th step, which is creating an action plan. So this is where we're really designing that journey moving forward. Typically, when we're talking about organizational culture, that's anywhere from 12 to 24 months of change initiatives. This is including typically factors like leadership development, as well as development across other climate factors, encouraging designing the organization in terms to be more facilitating, right, across those other 31 factors, how we give feedback, the amount of autonomy people have, how jobs are designed, communication structures, and so on. Good. So once we have clarity on where we're focusing, and again, begin building an action plan, those steps that we as an organization need to implement. And again, that is also driven very strongly by leadership development. So very, very often our organizational culture instruments are used in combination with our leadership tools. Very good strength of that strategy is the fact that we use the same model, that circumplex that you may have seen with the red, green, and blue across all of our instruments. So once we understand that model, we not only have a language to use to talk about and describe organizational culture, what's taking place now and what should be taking place, what's consistent with our values, but we also can use that language when we start thinking about ourselves in our own behavior, in our leadership roles. What should I be role modeling? What do I need to encourage in my people? These are very difficult, sort of intangible questions to answer without good data and models to understand these systems. So, for example, if we want achievement-oriented, goal-oriented, problem-solving kinds of behavior from our people, again, once we understand what that is and have a language around it, then not only can I understand what is achievement in this business and in my department, but I can also understand what is achievement-oriented behavior in myself and the kinds of things that I, again, should be role modeling and encouraging in my people and team. So it's that kind of coordinated, strategic development based on good, reliable information that predictably drives positive change and development in organizations. And this is then leading to the development journey. Happy to talk about this more. Again, that 18-24 months of development, there are several things that we should be doing during that process. We have the ability, for example, to pulse survey, to check in on just a few outcomes, a few climate factors along that journey to make sure that those data points are moving, to see whether the culture is shifting. And if not, that allows us to correct and get the organization back on track. It's tremendously powerful to be able to see how the change is happening in our organization as we implement that change. There are other ways to do this as well. For example, through qualitative feedback and focus groups, and checking in with people about what's going on and whether things are changing. And have you noticed? Anyway, lots of great practices for development. That's a whole other topic, but that is the final stage in the journey in terms of actually implementing and creating that change. Of course, this all typically comes to, I don't want to say comes to an end, but the last piece in the model is to remeasure. So for developmental tools, typically we're using those instruments at least twice. Initially to understand where we are, what's currently taking place, how that's affecting our people and performance. And then we want to learn from that and create some change and remeasure to see to what extent we've really moved things in a positive direction. And then build from those learnings. To be honest with you, I typically find that most of the organization's development really almost happens after that second measurement, because that is a tremendously empowering step. We can see in the organization that this is working, things are changing, the outcomes, feedback around engagement and those KPIs is far more positive than it was previously. And that is a wonderful feedback. It really reinforces the initiative. And that also is an opportunity to, add in a few new tweaks and changes. So if we've been working on leadership development and communication for the last 12 months, and that's been really working well, great. Now we can add in something else. We've got all of those climate factors to lever. At what point can we start adding in even more? So that's very much the basis of the development journey, and great benefits to remeasurement. Apologies, I didn't bring up my last slide where I sort of have the detailed steps around those final implementation phases. Hopefully that is helpful. So we do have, again, more depth on this. This is a very high-level example of the development journey for an organization, based on a calendar, 24 months. At the top, you see a model that we refer to and describe in accreditation that's talking about how we create development in organizations. This is the awareness, acceptance, planning, and action steps of development. And this below that, then you can see sort of a calendar structure of how those phases are playing out. And then there are different activities from, debriefing the results, coaching leaders, checking in with focal groups, leveraging change champions in the organization, that journey that we build and assist in building for our clients. All right, well, I certainly used the 10 minutes, so that was successful. I hope that is helpful in terms of how we conduct projects and what that process actually is. Let me just take a moment to see if there are any questions in the chat. And let me see. Sharing presentations. Okay. Very good. Yes, a few people apparently have asked for the content that I've been showing. Very happy to do that. So it won't take me any time at all after this to set up a Hightail folder, and I'll happily share that link with everyone who took part. Thank you. All right, that's been our first hour and 10 minutes or so. So thank you to everyone who has joined this early on. I think it's fair to take a 10-minute break, and then we can continue. Very good. And I'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. All right, I think that's been 10 minutes. Welcome back. So, for those of you, if anyone has just been joining, well, first of all, welcome to Human Synergistics' first roundtable event. Happy to have you joining us. This is something we have been looking forward to, as an opportunity to kind of reach out to a broader audience, and especially to hear from you in terms of any questions that you may have about organizational culture, leadership development, the instruments that we offer from Human Synergistics, anything like that. So we've covered several interesting topics so far, but again, any questions that you might have, be very happy to take those. I'll put up a little whoops, sorry. So again, this is our first roundtable event, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm using a new technology, but so far this seems to be going well. And again, thank you guys for joining. There seem to be, I've always realized over the years how many questions there are about these topics of culture, which is one of those things that is not only incredibly important in organizations, obviously, but is difficult to conceptualize. In many cases, it's challenging to discuss. We need, a language to understand really what is this all about? How is it affecting our people? Where is it coming from? And I think HS tools do a fantastic job of creating that context and structure to understand those sorts of things. So, if we have any questions from anyone, please just feel free to enter those into the chat. I should be able to see that. Um, Anyone's free to post anything at all. Happy to answer and or attempt to. And if we don't have any questions, then I will happily share additional content from my side, things that I think might be interesting. We've already this is our first hour has been completed, so thank you guys for hanging in. Again, the idea of this is that people can come and go as they like. So pop in, ask a question, hopefully get an answer that's helpful, learn something, and and head out as you like. So you don't have to be here the whole time. Just as is convenient for you, trying to be more accessible. All right. So this morning in the first hour, we've already talked about a few interesting things. We may discuss them briefly later on in the session as well. Those are a few new developments from Human Synergistics, including the new LSI Plus report with new customized text from our Acumen system. Secondarily, we talked about the new artificial intelligence system that has been programmed within our platforms to create additional report content and help with understanding those statistics and giving us key areas to focus in the organization's climate for development. So those two topics will hopefully were helpful. We also talked about the 4Ds, which is hopefully a short and easy-ish way to explain organizational culture, and more importantly, perhaps in the context of things like employee well-being and performance, as well as organizational climate and values, so that we can really understand the big picture of how this all plays out in organizations. And just before the break, we talked about our project process. So, just the high level content around how we work with and coordinate with our clients as well as our accredited network to create not only conduct these projects, but help drive and create that positive change. All right. There does seem to be a question here. Thank you very much, Mr. Jochen. So we mentioned culture bites by the Australian practice, correct? Let's see here. Could these and other explanatory videos be made available as well? Yes, absolutely. So we talked before the break about the fact that there have been a few requests for the content that I've been sharing. Some of the PowerPoints and so on. So yes, after this roundtable, I'll set up a little hightail folder, put all of that content in there, and I'll also add a link to the wonderful Culture Bites episodes from our Australian office. I think you'll find those to be great, and you'll see there are sessions in there not only on the climate factors as I mentioned before, but all 12 culture styles and how culture affects performance and well-being, and all of those very important and relevant topics. And those sessions are not only helpful for our accredited network, but I do know that our clients are listen to those as well and share the podcast amongst their leadership teams. And I think that's fantastic. Really helps to spread the learnings. Um, Good. All right. If there are any other questions, please feel free to jump in. If not, then I will share something else that I think to be interesting. All right. So maybe it makes sense at this time to kind of give a high level introduction to what human synergistics is all about. I find that has always been a bit of a challenging conversation to have, given the breadth of really what we do, as well as the fact that we do have instruments across different levels. So we talk pretty heavily about organizational culture and leadership development, but we also have instruments for the purposes of measuring team dynamics and team behavior, as well as individual level tools. So I think this presentation does a fairly nice job of explaining what we're all about and how we use these instruments at different levels. Oops, I need to, excuse me, need to remove my banner. Again, if you do have any questions, please type them in. I will check in on those. All right. So the presentation's entitled "The Difference That HS Makes," and I think that's a very important thing to focus on. Excuse my formatting problem there on the right-hand side. I thought I cured that. Um, the difference that human synergistics makes, and that really is kind of the point. The instruments that we've developed are for the purpose of development. So these are not assessments. These are instruments to measure what is currently playing out, for example, in organizational culture. Again, how that is affecting our people and performance, how that relates to our values, and hopefully learning from this, the organization, its leadership team are able to move forward and drive a more constructive, high performing organizational culture. And that purpose of development is true really at every levels of our instruments, whether we're talking about organizational culture or team development or individuals. So this slide is something we discuss. By the way, if you join us in a circumflex accreditation, I'll describe that a little later on as well. This is content that we include in that introduction. So the purpose of human synergistics really is about inspiring people and propelling your business. We specialize in providing proven change strategies that enable people to reach their potential, teams to achieve synergy, and organizations to achieve outstanding results. Human synergistics, I believe we've been around for, what is it, 54 years at this point. So a very long history of researching and developing these tools. They've been used globally for, in many cases, well over 40 years. Very well established instruments. And thankfully, you can read about a lot of our culture development in case studies and books that I will talk about a little later as well. So a long history of not only culture development, but going all the way back to the 80s, but also team and individual development going back into the 70s. All right. Our purpose is all about creating positive change, changing the world one organization at a time. So there are two couple of models here we're looking at, the why and the how. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing our circumflex model. That's the blue, red, and green model that we use to depict essentially patterns of behavior within, for example, organizational culture. That model is the same model that we use across each level of our instruments. It was developed by Human Synergistics in 1971 as a model with which we could depict psychological patterns within individuals. This is the LSI-1, or Lifestyles Inventory, and how those psychological patterns affect the well-being of those individuals, primarily focusing on aspects of psychological well-being like satisfaction, motivation, level of stress, satisfaction with accomplishments, free time, career, family life, health, so on and so forth. The original instruments, the LSI-1, primarily was developed for two reasons. Firstly, to be used in clinical settings for development and coaching, and secondarily, for research purposes. And in both of those cases, we need to have scientifically reliable and valid instruments, which is why Human Synergistics focuses so heavily on those quality standards. Very happy about that. So that circumflex model, again, was developed to depict psychological patterns in individuals. But over the years, and happy to discuss this separately, we've realized that that model can be applied to other levels of behavior, social psychology. So we can use that same model to understand not only psychological patterns, but also behavioral patterns in individuals, as well as behavior within teams and groups,
and as we've already discussed, behavioral patterns within organizations. So I'll touch on this a little later on, but that means we have one model and one language and one set of terminology to talk about, again, leadership behavior, team dynamics, organizational culture. And this is one of the things I find consistently to be extremely helpful to the clients that we work with. And we have one framework and one language to apply across all of these levels, and understanding what is a more achievement oriented culture that we want. How do we do that within our teams? What is achieve anyway? Tremendously helpful to have a shared common language. Okay, so we're then doing that across various levels, and that's the model that you're seeing on the left-hand side. Sort of looks like a water drop, uh, the ripples in a pond, something like this. At the very center, so this is really referring to the different instruments that we've developed over the years. The very center is where we started with the lifestyles inventory that I mentioned just a moment ago, and then it moves out, and I'll show you these levels in a moment, to teams, leadership impact, organizational culture, and so on. So one model to understand and measure those patterns across various levels. So the next slides, we're going to look at each of those levels and have an understanding of what we're measuring. So when we start at the very beginning, again, we're looking at individual thinking and behavioral patterns, what we call styles of thinking and behavior. And those are things that we measure in the lifestyles inventory. Again, if you were with us about an hour ago, we happily walked through a sample lifestyles inventory report. And not just that, but the LSI Plus report, which is the brand new available now LSI report with additional customized text descriptions, recommendations for development, a lot of additional support material and help. In any case, this tool has been used for decades for personal development, and there are wonderful case studies and examples of how these tools function to help create positive change. So what we're trying to do is to be as quick and clear as we can in terms of not only what we're measuring, again, those patterns on this profile, but really why that matters. Behavioral patterns, psychological patterns are interesting to measure, firstly, because they have strong relationships to outcomes along the lines, again, of things like psychological well-being and as well as performance. And secondarily, they're very interesting, I think, to measure because they can be adapted. Psychological patterns and behavioral patterns are actually very, very difficult to measure. This is, in my opinion, speaks to the genius of Dr. Lafferty and in many ways Dr. Cook and Dr. Zumal in the development of these kinds of tools. But the not only understanding that, but this enables us to create positive predictive change. Once we understand not only how I behave, but perhaps more importantly, how my behavior affects my ability to do things like solve problems effectively, communicate effectively with other people, lead and influence my team. Then once I understand that relationship, then we can move forward and coach and develop to simply more frequently use those behaviors that more consistently predict positive performance and well-being. So at the individual level, we're looking at this in terms of two comparisons. So if you look at the left-hand side of the PowerPoint that's in front of us, we're looking at what we call LSI1 data. This is the psychological aspect of the instrument. This is how people are describing themselves in terms of self-concept and the patterns therein. And what we're doing, this is a fairly large data set. I think we've got about 40,000 people in here. And what we're doing is looking at people who, on the left-hand side, the very left extreme, who have described themselves in primarily what we describe as constructive ways, psychologically satisfaction oriented, versus people who are describing themselves in the least constructive ways. So essentially, out of 40,000 people, we're taking the top 10% who view themselves most constructively versus most defensively. And then we're looking at below this how they describe themselves in terms of, again, primarily aspects of psychological well being. How satisfied am I? How much stress do I experience? And so on. And you can see with those little blue bars compared to the green and yellow ones that people who are thinking in more psychologically constructive directions consistently report higher levels of motivation, satisfaction, lower levels of stress. And this very much is the psychological basis of human synergistics that then we have applied to other levels. Really, the next level is what we're seeing on the right hand side of this slide, and that is behavior. So this is also measured with the same instrument, but now we are asking others to provide feedback in terms of how the focal participant behaves, and measuring that in terms of behavioral patterns. Again, using the same circumplex model to understand that, the same language. And of course, you do find, which was one of our Dr. Cook's, perhaps, and Dr. Lafferty's original theses, that there are strong relationships between psychological behave patterns and behavioral patterns, right? People who think in achievement oriented ways. What is the goal? How am I going to get there? What might get in the way? How am I going to solve problems to move ahead? If we're thinking in those ways, that tends to encourage and result in the ability to more frequently behave in achievement oriented ways, actually making decisions, considering alternatives, taking action, and accomplishing goals. So that relationship between psychological and behavioral patterns is something that we very much measure within the LSI instrument. In any case, on the right-hand side, we're doing very much the same kind of comparison. We're looking at those 40,000 people and identifying, in this case, those people who were described by others as behaving most constructively on the left versus the least constructively on the right. Then below this, you're looking at bar charts that have to do with performance criteria across a few different aspects, things like overall effectiveness in their job. I can't read the text; it's a little too small. I hope you can, but from memory, it's things like ability to manage time, communicate effectively, solve problems effectively, and so on. So, and we're looking at, again, the differences between those people who are behaving most constructively versus least constructively. In both cases, you're seeing very positive trends when we are able to think and behave in more constructive, psychologically satisfaction oriented directions. All right. Perhaps a bit abstract, but again, the point is that not only are we able to measure these patterns, but we're able to demonstrate that these patterns have a very strong effect on the well-being and performance of people. And with that information and context, then we can learn from this, and most importantly, move forward again to simply focus on and developing more frequently those behaviors that contribute to our well-being and performance. So that's essentially, very quick terms, how this plays out at the individual level. And then, of course, we also have instruments at the next level, which at this point we describe as the teams, or as the instrument is called, the Group Styles Inventory, or GSI. So we have a little page here around what the instrument is and concepts around why we might use this to develop teams. Again, the purpose of these tools is to primarily develop aspects of well-being and performance. When we look at teams and groups, this is things like ability to use time effectively, solve problems, communicate with one another. Also, aspects of well-being within the team, things like, am I satisfied being a member of this team? What I actually carry out, and am I committed to the decisions that the team makes? Very interesting sort of well-being and performance aspects of teams. By the way, if you're not familiar with human synergistics, we have a tremendous catalog of history of research, and some of the research that we've conducted at the team level I find to be really fascinating in terms of not only understanding how teams behave, but again, how that influences their ability to solve problems effectively, make most effective decisions, and so on. This is very much the same sort of comparative profile that you saw in the previous slide, but we are in this case looking at team dynamics and team behavior. So we are not only looking in this case at thousands and thousands of team members, but looking at those teams that are currently, again, behaving most constructively versus least constructively on the left-hand side. And then secondarily on the right, how that plays out and influences their ability to perform, as well as the well-being of those team members. And again, you're seeing those very large differences between the two, connecting the fact that teams that work with one another and approach their work in more constructive ways are far more consistently effective in what they're doing and solving problems and making decisions, and also report that they're far more satisfied as members of those teams. Again, not only measuring these patterns, but why they matter and the relationship between behavioral patterns and performance. All right. This again goes to the next level. This is our impact tools. These are the leadership impact and management impact. I won't spend any extra time on these tools at this point, but sometimes I do find that they need a little more explanation, particularly to differentiate them from other individual 360-degree tools that we have, such as the LSI that we just looked at previously. So yes, these are individual 360-degree feedback tools, but they're used very differently, and what they're measuring is very different from what we're measuring in the LSI. So again, in LSI, we're measuring the psychological and behavioral patterns of the individual, as well as how those patterns influence their well-being and performance. In the case of the impact instruments, we are not measuring the thinking and behavior of the leaders. We are literally measuring how leaders are influencing other people to think and behave. So these are tremendously unique instruments. I believe they are the only that exist that measure essentially the psychological and behavioral influence of one individual, the leader or manager, upon others, those whom they lead. So, these instruments are used very often for leadership development to help ensure that our leaders are encouraging the kind of behavior that we want from our people that is going to lead our business forward. And they're also used very frequently in combination with culture development. Because many times when our clients use our culture level instruments to measure their cultures, and once they have a concept in terms of what they want to change and develop, it is key, and happy to talk about this separately, that leaders encourage and facilitate that behavior that we want from our people. And these instruments are literally measuring the extent to which an individual leader is encouraging these patterns of behavior in the people that they lead. The short story here is that leaders who encourage constructive behavior in others are not only described as themselves being more effective as leaders, but actually are encouraging their people and teams to use more functional behavior and drive high performance throughout the people whom they lead. Those people who encourage more defensive patterns, unfortunately, this of course has consequences. So you can see how this plays out across leaders in the instrument leadership impact on the left-hand side of the slide. And you can see the same patterns we're finding in the effect that managers have in terms of their how they influence the behavior of people whom they lead. All right, happy to talk about that later if there are any questions about the difference between um, individual behavior versus impact. Kind of fascinating stuff. But in any case, I want to keep us on track and move to the last level of our instruments, which is the organizational level. So, at the organizational level of our tools, we actually have three different instruments that we utilize in order to complete and create what we describe as the how culture works model. If you were with us about an hour ago, I took you through my sort of a quick and dirty way to introduce the How Culture Works model, those four stages, what we're actually measuring, and some concepts in terms of how we characterize and understand this. Um, Let me see what I have on my next slide. Yeah, I'll keep this fairly clean at this point. The point is here again, we're using, it is a different instrument. We are asking different questions, but at the end of the day, we're measuring those same behavioral patterns that we've discussed already at the individual and team levels and so on. So again, common model and a common language to understand these patterns. And again, what we're doing on this page with a comparative profile is looking at organizations on the left-hand side with primarily constructive cultures versus organizations on the right-hand side with less constructive cultures. And then we're simply looking at how they described outcome criteria with reference to the well-being and performance, and we measure this across three different levels. So you can actually see there are individual level outcomes like how satisfied are our people, motivation, engagement, stress. We also measure outcomes at the team level, aspects of quality at the team and departmental level, as well as the ability of teams to work cohesively within and across other teams within the organization. And finally, toward the bottom there on the right-hand side, we also have a few categories of organizational level outcomes. These are aspects of organizational adaptability, by the way, which is an outcome that many clients and many organizations today are interested in. This is essentially the capability of the organization to recognize a need to change and to be able to proactively and effectively respond to that need for change. We also ask questions around organizational level quality, the extent to which we're fulfilling our purpose and mission, and so on. In any case, you can see very large differences between what we tend to find in performance and well-being in organizations that are primarily constructive. Those are the blue chart bars on the left-hand side, versus organizations in which the culture is less constructive and more defensive. And we can see those gaps. Again, these are tremendously, actually large differences, right? It can be shown, and we can show in data that your organization's culture is the primary predictor of the well-being of your people, as well as their ability to perform personally, to perform and work effectively and cohesively within groups and teams, and to contribute to the overall performance of the organization. Um, so that is a good thing to know, powerful thing to be able to measure. And again, learning from this helps organizations to help to guide them forward in terms of in what direction we need to develop our culture in order to have more motivated and engaged employees who are more effective in what they do. And by the way, just to point this out briefly, these are the standard performance criteria that we include in our culture level instruments, but these can be customized as well. So when you have clients who are specifically interested in performance criteria like the frequency of errors or safety and these sorts of things, there are ways to customize to address that. And also other well-being criteria like the ever popular engagement, which is also a wonderful outcome to be able to build in and then understand not only how engaged our people are currently, but why is that and where is that coming from? And most importantly, moving forward, what can we develop within our culture to promote engagement within our employees? And that's very much the basis of this. All right. So that is our quick presentation there around um, human synergistics. And again, the difference that we make for our clients and organizations by giving them good, reliable, valid information about their organizations that help them to understand really how this is all playing out and happening, and therefore moving forward, what we can do to create a more positive, constructive, and effective organizational culture, or team, or individual. Lovely. Okay. So that's our difference that HS makes. Any questions about any of those concepts or any of those levels of tools or anything? I think I have yeah. So again, if you do, just feel free to type those into the chat, and happy to address those. Very good. All right, we are doing well. Let me see. I think I have yet another hopefully interesting piece of information. One of the questions that we get very often is along the lines of how these instruments can be used in merger and acquisitions cases. So human synergistics tools not only are used very widely around the world to measure and develop organizational culture, but they're also used in some specific cases. And merger and acquisitions, I really believe, are one of the best ways to use these kinds of instruments and models. So I'm going to show you an actual case. This is a project that I had the pleasure of collaborating with Better Business on, and greetings to them. This was a very successful culture measurement and journey for very large global organizations that were merging. So when we talk about merger and acquisition cases, I first point, and when we look at this case, we will see this. I always recommend that we should be gathering this data as early as possible. I also work with organizations who have merged, and now years later, they are continuing to recognize that that merger has not really played out successfully. And when we talk about mergers, I hope you recognize it really is organizational culture that explains the reasons that merger and acquisitions fail or not. And I hope you'll see by the end of this presentation the really extreme um, help that this kind of context and information provides in merger and acquisition cases. So we're actually going to look at real data of a couple of organizations and how I like to conceptualize that data as we help those organizations moving toward a merger. If you're working with an organization that has already gone through merger and acquisitions, and may have recognized that there are challenges playing out in the business, happy to help with that. It's actually quite fascinating. One of the things that I oftentimes say is that there are two things that you really don't want in your organization's culture. The first thing that you don't want is what we describe as defensive behavioral patterns. Happy to talk about that separately, but that's the first thing. The second thing that you really don't want are really significant radical differences in the current culture across different areas and parts of the organization. It is typical, and happy to talk about this, that the organization's culture differs across things like various locations, functional areas, and notoriously hierarchical levels. But for the most part, what we do want to create in organizations is firstly a constructive organizational culture where people are primarily encouraged and expected to work towards goals, achieve excellence, think creatively, bring their own unique ideas, solve problems, learn from mistakes, support one another, share information. These are the kinds of things that are consistent with organizational values and do, in fact, contribute to the performance of your people. So, not only do you want constructive behavior in your organization, but you do also want that as consistently as possible. We want that kind of goal orientation, creativity, and collaborative behavior, not just from leaders and not just from people in one department or another, but we do find that it is best to encourage that across the entire organization. So, this helps to illustrate how we do that. All right, so this is data and profile from company A. We can see the complete how culture works model. If you were with me previously, I showed you one of these already and discussed through a couple of examples. Again, this is another organization. This is the full model. On the left-hand side, we're seeing the ideal culture as described by the organization, what behavior they want taking place from in their organization and their people. This, by the way, is, again, not only the first step that I try to achieve with clients, but tremendously helpful in terms of then giving us a reference point against which we can compare to our current culture. Understanding our current culture is a wonderful thing, but being able to understand that in comparison to what we want taking place in the organization is very, very helpful. We call this the culture gap, the difference between the current and the ideal descriptions. All right. So in any case, on the far left, we're seeing that company's ideal. The next stage of the model, again, if you were with me previously for the 4Ds, the define, design, do, and deliver, now we're in the design section of the system. This is where we are designing jobs, how we set goals, how we give feedback, what our values and mission and purpose is, how we communicate that to employees. This is not culture. These are the structures and systems that we design in the organization that influence how people behave, approach their work, and work with one another within that system and context. So that second section of the model with all those little sub boxes is organizational climate. We not only measure climate, but of course, then the third thing is the current operating culture. So you can see that profile, and you can also see the gap that I referred to earlier. Exists in every organization to some extent or the other. There is always a bit of a difference between what we are currently doing and what we say we really in best practice should be doing. And that gap is typically with reference to we are currently not behaving as constructively as we say we should, and we are currently behaving perhaps a bit more defensively than we say we should. Happy to talk about this separately. I find the gap comparison to be tremendously helpful for clients. But I always say there are two main reasons by which you may want to address culture, and two main justifications for which I suggest organizations to embark on that positive development journey. Those two things are, firstly, a gap exists between the current and ideal. What we're currently doing is different from what we say we should be doing. And by the way, that ideal profile is very consistent, and happy to talk about and illustrate this separately, is very consistent with organizational values. So really that blue profile on the far left hand side is a visual representation of the behavior that is consistent with the values of the organization. That alone is tremendously helpful. Being able to knowing your values is one thing. Knowing how we live those values, what I need to encourage in my team, what behavior I need to role model to really not only live, but encourage and facilitate and enable those values is another thing. And this is tremendously helpful to create that clarity. Okay, so one reason to develop culture is because what's happening currently isn't what we say should be happening, and that's a great reason. The second reason to develop culture is because what is currently playing out is not as effective as it could be. And this is with reference to the current culture, the third section of the model, and how it is affecting the final section of the model. Again, the outcomes, the well being and performance of our people. Teams and broadly the organization's effectiveness. So again, those current culture patterns driving those outcomes. So this is the full culture model. I won't go into any more detail on this unless there are questions. Please feel free to, again, add those to the chat, and I'll take the banner away so it doesn't get in the way. I do see I have a question. Give me 3 seconds. I'll make sure I. Okay, I'll come back to this one at the end just to keep the flow. All right. So this is company A and all of their data, and then we get to see company B, which they will be and did merge with successfully, thankfully, and we can see all of their data. Again, ideal description, climate factors, current operating culture, and effectiveness factors at the end outcomes. So rather than digging into each of these individual organizations for merger case, we do that as well. But for merger cases, I like to sort of conceptually align these organizations and then start stepping through this content, hopefully in a way that is helpful to them. So stack them on top, and then let's start looking at what we can learn. The first thing that we can learn, I think, is actually really fantastic, and that is how similar or dissimilar are the values of these organizations. I really don't know of any other way that this could be measured and quantified. And it's something that we do in every case with merger and acquisitions because it is extremely powerful to be able to understand and describe, what is appropriate and ideal here in our organization and what is valued and appropriate in that organization and how similar or dissimilar is this. So I've actually had um, students writing dissertations on this concept of whether it's possible to measure organizational values and the differences between them in order to do some due diligence in merger and acquisition cases to make sure that our values are aligned before these organizations come together. Typically, and this is certainly the case, I would argue that these organizations' values are very much aligned. When we look at what they are describing in terms of what should be taking place, what is ideal and preferred, they are describing essentially, for the most part, the same types of patterns. That's a wonderful thing. I remember debriefing this together with Ralph of Better Business, and what a great experience. But very, very helpful for leadership teams to be able to recognize how similar or different our values are. And then the next step really is to combine that data together into one, at least in my opinion, one shared ideal. One of the objectives I try to accomplish with our clients as they build their culture journey is to create clarity on where we want to go. And that is, again, connected with the ideal description. So when we're thinking about merger and acquisition cases, not only do we want that clear picture of where we're going, but I very strongly believe we need one picture of where we're going. It's not particularly helpful to have, one ideal profile for company A and a different one for company B, even though they're very, very similar. You want to communicate and encourage your people in both organizations to recognize that what we're moving toward the same common target, and that target is appropriate and applies to all of us. So in this case, the organizations and their leadership teams were able to recognize that yes, in fact, our values and the ideal descriptions are similar enough that we're happy to simply merge that data together proportionally, 50-50, and generate the ideal profile we're seeing on the extreme left-hand side. That's simply a combined data profile across both organizations. And that profile in the next slide, you'll see, will then replace the ideal profile for each of the organizations. Now we have one goal, one sort of north star that where it can guide us forward. I think that's a very important step. Now we're both moving in the same direction, or have the same goal at least. All right. So that's sort of step one. I always find that to be a very, very positive and helpful aspect of these instruments, especially again in merger cases. The next strength is really to be able to measure the current cultures of these organizations and to recognize again how similar or dissimilar they are. Again, M&As fail or succeed based on organizational culture and very much with reference to how similar or dissimilar their current operating cultures are. Um, so, firstly, when we compare these current cultures, they are, I would argue, fairly similar. So, broadly speaking, I guess that is a bit of good news for the organizations. We're not seeing really radical differences in those profiles. You know, one is completely red, the other is completely green. And then we would really be concerned about the viability of being able to get these organizations to functionally work together. But what a beautiful thing to know months before the merger actually takes place, so that you know and literally can predict how this merger is going to play out. By the way, there's a tremendous amount of data behind this, and I do remember spending quite a bit of time going through all of this across things like hierarchical levels and functional areas, comparing this all the way down to subgroup level so that we could predict which units will be able to work cohesively together because their current behavioral patterns are similar enough versus which parts of the organization will not be able to functionally work together. And this enabled the consulting group, again, Better Business, as well as the end user client, to begin developing those areas of the organization that were most sort of culturally misaligned, if you will, or different or disparate from one another, helping to coach and develop those groups more toward the ideal, therefore, not only creating a more constructive culture, but a more shared culture, meaning that by the time the organizations actually went through the structural merger, we had developed a more shared culture across those areas that previously would have been incompatible and really unable to work effectively together. I think that's really phenomenal information, not only to be able to recognize really whether this is going to come together or not, but where we're going to experience resistance and challenges and be able to preemptively move in and help coach and develop in a positive way a more shared behavior so that we can more effectively work and collaborate. Okay. So, very, very interesting. The other thing that's very nice about this kind of comparison is it allows the organizations to recognize, and this is, I think, very, very important, that the biggest difference we're really seeing is not between the current culture of company A versus the current culture of company B. The real difference we're seeing is that neither of our current cultures are consistent with what we are saying we should be doing. The real gap isn't, again, in between company A and company B's current culture. The real gap is between the current culture and the ideal. And that reference is, I think, particularly helpful. One of the issues that I have noticed over the years is challenging when we conduct merger projects is we need to be very careful not to fall into the trap of believing that one organization's culture is right and the other organization's culture is wrong, or one is better than the other. That is a very unhelpful way, in my opinion, of looking at organizational culture. What we need to recognize is what we are doing is primarily right different from what we say we should be. It's not us versus them. It's all of us moving toward where we want to go. So I find that to be a tremendously helpful way to frame the development, so that this is not, again, us versus them, but rather all of us working together to move toward a better future. Very positive. All right. So again, this allows the organizations to start thinking about those differences between our current and the ideal states. And again, then secondarily, focus on the secondary motivation for potential culture development, and that is understanding our current culture with reference to our performance. And again, in both cases, we can see that we could have even higher performance than we are currently experiencing in the organization if we were to promote more constructive behavior. Now, we can show this, it's not in this presentation, but we can show this relationship through things like correlation analyses, subgroup analysis, and also comparative profiles that we show and are included standard in our culture reports. But in any case, based on those reports, you are very clearly able to understand not only how satisfied and motivated and engaged our people are, but what patterns within our current culture are promoting those kinds of outcomes and which are detracting from. And the message that the end user will recognize is that in both cases, we need to move toward more constructive behavioral norms. When we look at our ideal, right, the gap is we're not as constructive as we say we should be. We are more defensive, red and green currently than we say we should be. That's the values justification. Secondarily, again, we can very clearly show in data, subgroups, and comparative profiles that within your organization, constructive behavior tends to promote more positive performance and well-being. And that is the second justification for culture development. By moving toward those more constructive patterns, we not only are living our values, but we are promoting our performance. I think that is very, very helpful and a tremendously stable basis for a well-designed development initiative. Okay, so once we understand all of that, then we can take the next step and start to look at, well, where is this coming from? So if we do in fact recognize across both organizations that we would benefit from developing what we describe as more constructive and less defensive cultural norms, then the next question is, how do we do that? And really the other question is, why are we, why does the gap exist? Why are we currently not as constructive as we say we should be? And how do we change this? So that leads us really to organizational climate. Again, not culture. These are those structural aspects, the systems of the organization that we have designed. Again, like how goals are set, how jobs are designed, how much autonomy people have in different roles in the organization, how frequently we give positive versus negative feedback. That is not culture, that is a system that is designed, and people then behave, approach their work, and interact with one another as a response to how we primarily design and lead those organizational systems. So, as I mentioned previously, we actually measure 31 factors of organizational climate that influence culture. By the way, typically the most impactful of those 31 factors are aspects of leadership, which we also measure. So we can demonstrate in data the fact that you have likely heard that organizational culture is driven primarily through leadership. Lots of other things shape the behavior of your people as well, and those are other things that we measure, but it's always important to keep in mind that leaders are key to this kind of development. All right. So when we look at the climate factors, then you'll see that the organizations are designed somewhat differently. And this is the reason that they have currently somewhat different cultures from one another, and also explains, again, the gap between the current and the ideal. The first thing I always like to do when we look at the climates of two organizations that are merging is look for strengths. So I think in always when we're using developmental instruments, the first message should be, what are the strengths here? Whether that's at the individual level, what are my personal strengths? What are the behaviors I'm using that are really helping me to be effective to communicate with my team or helping me to really get things done? What behaviors might I be doing that might get in the way of that kind of effectiveness? That's tremendously helpful, again, at each level. But starting with strengths is very good because, firstly, it's a positive message, but maybe more importantly, it helps us to recognize and reinforce what is functioning well in the organization, and secondarily, to leverage that moving forward. I talk about this a lot when we talk about culture development. When we want to develop culture through developing our shifting climate, it is very helpful to use the strengths within the organization's climate to address the opportunities within climate. So I'll give you a quick example of that. Not too long ago, well, maybe 3 years ago, I did a very nice culture project with a hospital in Switzerland. And they had all of this data, and they were looking at the gap between their current and ideal and all of these good things. And they got into their climate factors to look at, well, what can we leverage to create positive change? And when they were looking within their climate, they noticed some weaknesses, some factors that were inhibiting in terms of the structure. One of those factors I recall is something called significance. and another factor called interdependence. So these are aspects of organizational climate. More specifically, they're aspects of job design. Significance relates to essentially the extent to which the employee understands really what their job is, but more importantly, how their job contributes to the goals of the organization as a whole. How does what I do matter in terms of the organization? And interestingly, can I recognize how, for example, good work that I do helps the organization, and can I recognize how, if I don't do my job particularly well, the consequences that that may have for the organization? Interdependence is similar, but a bit more social. This is, do I understand not only what my job is, but how good work done by me has a positive effect on the ability of other people in the organization to also do good work? And can I recognize how, if I do poor work or make mistakes or that sort of thing, how that has a consequence not only for my work, but for the work of others within the organization? So significance and interdependence are aspects of job design in terms of, do we clearly understand those aspects of our work? By the way, if we understand those things, it will tend to encourage and facilitate constructive behavior. If I know why my job matters, I know what kind of behavior I can use. Then, if I know why it's important and how good work affects others, then I'm more likely to try to do things like do good work and achieve goals and learn from mistakes and so on. If I don't think my job matters and I don't think it has an effect on anyone around me, then the behavior I will express likely will be a bit different. So that's just an example of climate factors and how they influence how people behave and respond in these systems. In any case, in the hospital, unfortunately, and kind of counterintuitively, significance and interdependence were scoring quite low. And the question from the client was, well, how might we address this, and how can we shift it? When I was looking at their other climate factors, I found some very positive things. And one of the very positive strengths of their climate was something that we call downward communication. Downward communication has to do with how we communicate systemically. Downward, meaning how frequently do leaders communicate to their people? Do they communicate around along the lines of what we need from you? What is good work? What the goals are? Do you understand what your leader is telling you? Can you act on it? Can you utilize that information? And their climate factors around downward communication were absolutely fantastic. So let's use that strength to address the opportunity. And this is very much part of their development initiative that had great success. Let's use that downward communication. Leaders need to start talking to their people and communicate more around what your job is, why it matters, what the purpose and goal of this hospital is, how we want to serve patients, and how every job in that hospital matters, and how, when it's done well, it not only helps us serve patients, but it helps each other. And if we can communicate that, then we can use that effective communication to more clearly understand our job design and thereby promote more constructive norms. So, in any case, understanding the strengths are tremendously helpful. Not only is it positive reinforcement, it also means by the way, we're not necessarily, changing those things that are already functioning very effectively in the organization system, but rather leveraging them to address the opportunities. Okay. So those are some of our strengths. And again, I love focusing on shared strengths, those things that we are doing quite effectively. Or again, if you were with me about an hour and a half ago, those things that we're doing in facilitating ways, structured in facilitating ways in the organization, those are shared strengths. That's great. Second step is to look for opportunities. And again, because this is a merger and acquisition case, I'm trying to look for shared opportunities. I don't want, in the very beginning of this development initiative, to create the idea that there are big differences within us and so on. So what we want to focus on are our shared strengths and our shared opportunities. Those are the little gray arrows. I hope you can see that. Um, Again, when we measure all of these 31 factors across two organizations, you'll always find a few shared strengths and you'll always find a few typically shared opportunities. And those then serve as the basis typically for the development initiative moving forward. These are things that we all could benefit from across both organizations. And again, in the merger and acquisition case I'm referring to, this kind of development was initiated before the formal merger ever took place, so that we are leveraging our strengths and to address those opportunities to develop the cultures before the cultures and the organizations actually come together. Again, creating a more both constructive and shared behavioral norm. All right. So, and I typically, and I would recommend that serve as the general basis for the first development initiative. So something like the first 12 or 18 months of change. Again, we all have the same goal. We all are working on the same levers to develop. That is, I think, a fantastic way to guide organizations forward in merger and acquisitions. Once they've done that, and we've made some progress and we've developed a more shared culture and that is functioning, then I think we can get into the next topic, which is actually looking for differences. Again, I hesitate to do that too early on because we don't want to emphasize differences across those organizations to members in a way that would encourage them to believe that, it's an us versus them kind of situation. However, once we've created some shared norms, then I think we can look at those differences and should and can benefit from that, because what you'll find is that there are some strengths in one company that are opportunities in the other, and vice versa. And if we can recognize that, then we have an opportunity to learn from one another. And this is a great way to leverage the strengths of both organizations as they merge. Unfortunately, without these kinds of instruments, this is incredibly rare. Otherwise, we tend not to leverage the strengths of both organizations. In most cases, you end up with one organization sort of, dominating and the other organization, and we oftentimes lose the strengths that the acquired organization really had. That's far too common. It's absolutely unnecessary. So here is a fantastic method to learn the strengths of both organizations. And, it's almost sort of like a cross pollination, right? What are you doing well? How are you doing that? Let's do it on our side as well. And what are we doing that you can learn from? So in this example, just to be a little bit specific, you can see the boxes. So in the organization at the top, they have particularly effective communication. That's the lower left-hand box that's sort of outlined in blue. Sorry, that's not particularly clear. So they have quite effective, downward communication, upward communication, these sorts of things that we're looking at. So the other organization can think about structuring its communication in similar ways. Great way to learn from each other. In the other case, we're looking at aspects of job design. I mentioned a couple of those already. Significance and interdependence. Again, in company B, the lower one, those things are quite positive. Company A, they have some opportunity. So great, let's learn from one another. And in this case, you do have a bit of two different development initiatives. Company A is going to be working on their job design based on what they've learned from Company B. Company B is going to be working on their communication based on what they've learned from Company A. And again, you're not only learning from one another, which reinforces the psychological perspective that we are one organization. We are encouraged and expected to work together, not against one another. And you really are leveraging the strengths of both organizations and building something that was better in the end than either of us were in the beginning. And that is not only a real merger, but a positive developmental growth merger. And that is unfortunately tragically rare. And again, completely possible and facilitated by good data and good models so that we can really understand what is happening in the organization, where is that coming from, and really the system of the organization. All right. I believe that is my last slide on merger and acquisition, at least that example. We have, by the way, many case studies, articles published on best practices for merger and acquisition cases. I've been involved in many of them, and I have to say they probably are my favorite kind of culture development projects because they are so complex, and also because, well, there are real consequences for getting it wrong. And there are real wins for getting these things right. And there are so many ways in which this kinds of concepts and understanding can help organizations to get it right. when it counts, and it really does count in M&As. All right. I had one question, I think, on merger and acquisition, so I'll just read this out quickly, and then I think we're due for a break, but let's see what we have here. So, as a merger and acquisition, OCI is sometimes deemed as being quite a lot of work and money for an uncertain result. Oh, I'm going to enjoy this one. I have sometimes been asked for an M&A quick check to justify an in-depth survey. Any idea for that? Let me answer the second question first, because the first one I'll I'll come back to. Yes, absolutely. And in the case I just described to you, we did that. We did a small project before the client investing in the larger project. So maybe I can talk about that for a moment. It was fairly straightforward and very successful. If I can remove this, okay. So in the case I was referring to, we actually used the OCI, the Organizational Culture Inventory, initially just with the senior board members of both organizations. So this was the top, I think, 20 from Company A and Company B. Now, there are two ways to start with these teams. My preferred way is actually to use OCI Ideal to start with that first question around what are our values? Are they consistent enough for one another? That we're both, trying to move in the same direction. We have the same, ultimate goal in terms of what our culture should be, what behavior is appropriate here. So I like to use OCI Ideal with those top, 40 board members, and then create two profiles. What did company A versus B, and have that conversation. That is a very helpful to them, answers some of their initial questions that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to, and typically will encourage them to use that kind of concept in the future through the organization. The way that we did it in this case was a bit different. And again, Ralph from Better Business really had some good insights, and in this case recommended that we use the current profile, which I was a bit hesitant about because I was concerned we might get anyway. So we asked the board members about the current culture that they experience, and it was a really successful and effective session because we not only measured that, but when we went to debrief it and show them the profiles, I really just gave them the most brief of descriptions about what our circumplex model is, just so that they understood a bit of what is red versus green and blue. And then we put their profiles up on the screen, and they, without a label, no company A, company B, just two profiles. And everyone in the room immediately was able to identify this is ours and that's them. It's really one of the interesting things when you measure culture, and it really shows that you're measuring reality because people, when they look at their current culture profile, they're able to recognize that that's what we do. For better or worse, that's what I've experienced. And even though the differences were not particularly great, they were immediately able to recognize, which of those profiles represents us, and that really got them excited to understand how we do this, and how that recognize how that will help them move forward. And that was the kind of thing that really helped them to buy into the broader process. If that helps. Happy to talk about that. There are all kinds of ways to introduce these tools. That's a very sort of a simple explanation, but starting with the board members, doing a project just with them, seeing what they describe, helping them recognize how valuable this is and how helpful it is to have it in a model and with the terminology that we can understand and make tangible is huge. All right, let me come back to your first question, which was, so to repeat, as an M&A, OCI sometimes is deemed as being quite a lot of work and money for an unexpected result. Boy, I would love to argue with that one. The unexpected result you get is by not using tools, not doing due diligence, and just trying to jam two companies together with different cultures. And what you get, I don't know, and neither do you. That is uncertain, and it is risky, and it fails far too often, and it costs more money than an OCI project ever will. The best due diligence and the best investment I think you can make in your organization is in culture, and that is 10 times more true when we think about merger and acquisition cases. Projects, we're not talking about lots, the amount of money the organization will waste and lose is a function of maintaining two disparate cultures that don't work together, where we have people working against each other and wasting effort and being stressed and burning out and not sharing information. That's an ineffective solution. That's an ineffective system that will cost your business every day and every person within it. It is. I always say there's nothing more expensive than maintaining a defensive culture. It costs you in every outcome. Your people are less motivated, less engaged, less satisfied, less effective in solving problems, less effective in making decisions. They waste time. That we can measure that they make more frequent mistakes and errors. We can measure that your customers are giving you more negative feedback. How expensive is that? I mean, anyway, if having these and making this measurable and tangible creates certainty. With that information, I can tell that client not only what is happening, but what they need to do in the next 18 months to make certain that our cultures move in the direction that we want and guide more positive outcomes and create a more shared and collaborative merger. And I can create that certainty based on good data and decades of research. Without this, you are guaranteed to have uncertainty, if that answers it. All right. On that note, if there aren't any other questions, please, if there are, enter them in the chat. Love it. If not, then I would ask for a 10-minute break. I think we've gone well past our second hour. We only have about, oh goodness, we might only have about 30 minutes left. So we'll do a quick break. I just need a quick bio break, and then we will come back and see if there are any other questions and any other interesting content. Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome back. I don't think that was quite 10 minutes, but since we only have about 25 left, I thought might as well use the time we can. So during the break, there was a question about a program that we've been launched. I've launched together in collaboration with Sabine Kierdorf. And this is a leadership development initiative using horses. So something that's been done quite a bit. You'll probably hear if you haven't and read about leadership development learning sessions that include experiential time with horses. Might sound a little abstract, but it's really interesting to recognize the relationship between things like how leaders influence their teams and how people influence and lead horses and the parallels between that. And there's some wonderful exercises and learnings that can be facilitated by that experience. So this really speaks to the kind of the learning transfer. So I mentioned before that we have instruments at a variety of different levels, organizational culture, team level instruments, as well as tools for individual leaders. And this session particularly has been designed to work in combination with our instruments so that leaders who use our tools as part of the debriefing and as an exercise would actually come with us off site and go through this experiential session with the horses. So I think it's a fantastic thing. We can do them really all over the world. Sabina has been doing this kind of development and training all over Europe, China. She has a wonderful network of stables who she can work with. So we're able to do this really locally, wherever your client may be. So we really have two kind of forms of this. So we have the formal sessions that we're offering to clients. So if anyone's interested in having this kind of coaching for your leadership team or for the leaders that you're working with, please let us know. Happy to. Here's a little flyer. It's kind of a 2-pager. I know it's a little too small to read, but I'll drop this into the Hightail folder that everyone who has taken part will get a link to, so that you can have this flyer to understand a little bit of the concept more deeply. But just to explain, we really have two of these sessions. Again, one is the formal session that we can offer to your clients and leaders, and the other is a training and introduction session. So Sabina has her own horses. She's located in Solingen here in Germany, and we're offering regular training sessions really for not leaders, but for our accredited consultant network. So for our consultants who use these leadership instruments from Human Synergistics, who may be interested to do this kind of session, they can come see how that works, what the session feels like, how it all plays out. And then if they would like to do that, then we can set up the session, and then myself and Sabina and the accredited practitioner would all be part of the actual session that we conduct with the client. So we have a regular schedule of those sessions at Sabina's stable. So if you're interested in this and want to attend and see what it's all about, please reach out. We don't charge for this. It's for our accredited network. So you really do need to be accredited in Human Synergistics tools. That's the only, any of the tools. That's the only requirement. But then you're absolutely welcome to come see what that session would look and feel like, how we can customize that to your client's needs, and very happy to conduct those sessions. The feedback we've received thus far has been really phenomenal. So I'm looking forward to kicking off and conducting more of that kind of development and training for leaders. Great stuff. It really, the learning transfer is the thing. I mean, there's wonderful information in the reports you get from Human Synergistics, but the experience of sort of trying out new strategies and techniques of influence is really interesting. And not to go any further into detail, but one of the really kind of wonderful thing about horses is that we can try to do these exercises with them, and if it doesn't go quite like we wanted, we can try a different strategy and a different technique and immediately get a different response. One of the things leaders notice is that even as they embark on their own development journey with their team, it takes a little while before maybe people notice and people start changing and responding differently, right? So if I want my team to be more goal oriented, then it takes some time to build that, but it's hard to explain how and exactly why. But one of the fun things with horses is we can give people some different techniques to try, and you get an immediately different response. So it's a wonderful experiential way to encourage the learning transfer and to make sure leaders get the concept, see that it works, and feel it really, and then bring that back with them. So I really a great thing. And a lot of times, to be honest with you, just doing this sort of development offsite in a different setting is a really good way to help try to open people's minds and help them to look at these things from a different perspective and recognize what they can get out of it. So I think it's a great thing. Again, if you have any interest in that, please feel free to reach out. All right. Well, we're down to our last time. I do have additional content. Let me double check if there are any questions. Please feel free to add those to the chat. And otherwise, I thought I would share a presentation that I really haven't shared yet or before. And this is a rough structure of how I like to introduce our tools and really begin the debrief process with leadership teams. So let me see if I can find my file. There it is. Goodness, excuse that pause. Apologies. Like I said, this is the first roundtable we've done. I hope this is helpful information and reaching a broader audience. But please forgive my technical challenges as I learn the new system. So this is again is a presentation, and we probably don't have time for all of it, but I'll drop the whole thing into the Hightail folder so that you can have it. And this is a one way that I like to introduce these concepts to leadership teams. We're really not going to get into the depth that we get into in accreditation or any of that. The point is here to help you to see the kind of dialogue that I like to build and that seems to be helpful to help organizations and leaders to begin that journey forward. So anyway, we start with let's talk about culture. If we're going to talk about culture, I've certainly learned it helps to know what it is. If we're going to talk to 40 leaders about culture, we need to get clear on what are we really talking about? How do we define that? So anyway, I won't get into this given our time, but we need to make clear, what is organizational culture, and secondarily, why is it important? How does it affect people, their performance, and so on. And then very much one of the immediate things I like to do right at the beginning here is to do a little exercise with the leaders. And the exercise that I'm referring to is something we call the wall chart exercise. So I have a couple of versions of it here you'll see on the PowerPoint. This one is version A, where we're talking about performance. The point is that we need to have a conversation with the leaders about, again, why are we doing this? The most important question in a culture development journey is in the beginning is why. I oftentimes say I ask that question 3 times so that we get very, very clear on what is it that we are interested in improving and promoting. And by the way, that typically falls into 2 categories. When you talk to leaders and organizations and we talk about the case for development, they will typically describe 2 things as being the reason that they want to potentially develop. One is that they recognize that their current culture may not be driving the kind of high performance that they need from their people, teams, and in the organization, or that we need something different moving forward in the future. So it's not about whether our culture is right or wrong. It's about understanding where we are right now and moving forward, what we could be doing that would be more effective and productive. Secondarily, the second reason of why is because we may recognize that there's a difference between what's going on right now in the business and what our values say. And that is, again, the second reason for, I believe, um, development. Okay, so once we have that concept of why do we want to do this, if the answers were primarily those performance issues, we are interested in developing culture to create high performance, better customer orientation, better problem solving effectiveness, and so on, then this is the slide for you. The other option, and this is version B, is where we're talking about values, if that's the goal. Now, to be honest with you, if I have enough leaders, maybe 20, then I'll split them into 2 teams of 10 and I'll have them do the exercise in parallel. But one of them is doing the exercise based on the performance that we want, what we saw on the previous slide, and the other group of leaders is doing this based on our values. So let me explain the let me explain the exercise. So what we have are these 12 posters labeled ABC. And what they actually have on them, I know it's probably too small to see. I'll give you larger ones in a moment. Actually, I'll flip through as I'm describing. What they have on them are actually items and descriptions from the 12 styles of our circumplex model. Now, again, they're all mixed up and they're not labeled in a way that people can recognize which style is which, and that's intentional. The idea is that we put these posters up. It works very nicely virtually as well. We ask the leaders to read through them, it takes about 10 minutes, and then we ask them also to vote. And they have 2 positive votes and 2 negative votes. And the idea is that I, as the leader, need to vote for which 2 posters are going to help the performance criteria that we talked about wanting, what's going to help us, right, be more effective, serve customers more effectively, and so on. And the second group is, sorry, and the second votes are on which of these posters are not going to help us move forward. In fact, might get in the way or make it even more difficult for us to perform effectively. So simply, which of these posters is going to help us be effective? Which of these sorts of things is going to get in the way? Very, very simple. Takes about, like I said, 10 minutes. The other group, by the way, is doing the exercise at the same time with the same posters, but they're voting for the posters that are consistent with our values and represent us living our values versus those posters that are inconsistent with our values. Okay. So again, doesn't take very long. They go through and vote for what they want and what they don't, what's going to help and what's going to hinder. And then and only at that point, begin to describe the human synergistic circumplex. So this is a model that we use that's behind me, and we also use in our culture inventory to depict those behavioral patterns in the organization. Okay, so I explain that this is a causal model in terms of how culture drives well-being and performance. We talk about a brief introduction of the model, very brief introduction of the vertical dimension around satisfaction and security orientation. And then we get in, and this is as deep as we go, to a brief description of each of the styles. So I've been talking about achievement a lot, today. So achievement is an organization's culture in which members are expected to set challenging but realistic goals, establish plans to reach those goals, and pursue them with enthusiasm. So I go through, and of course, they get to read each of these and have a little introduction to what those styles are. And then we get to, jumping ahead, yes, and then of course, this is content I showed you earlier today, a few hours ago, just illustrating that we find, of course, that organizations with more constructive cultural norms have higher levels of performance and well-being than do organizations cultures with less defensive, less constructive cultural norms. Just a little data to show why this matters. Of course, we want a page of takeaways so we are clear. All right. So then we get to talk about what do we want, where are we going, and this is picking up on that exercise that we had done at this point about 20 minutes previously. Yeah, and now we just show the posters and we look at what people voted for and against, and then we map those back to our circumplex. So what were we saying we wanted, and what were we saying we don't want? It's a really fun exercise because they get a brief introduction, as you saw, to the circumplex and the styles, and then I hold up each of the posters and say, "This one that we wanted, which one is this?" And they read the style and they, "Oh, that sounded like achievement." Anyway, then they recognize where this all falls, and lo and behold, and it's just a beautiful thing. All of their positive votes will strongly tend to fall on the constructive styles toward the top, and all of their negative votes for the things that they don't want, things they recognize will make it more difficult for us to perform at our best, things they recognize are inconsistent with our values, will consistently map to the bottom security oriented patterns in the model. They're absolutely correct, but I found this is a wonderful way for them to connect with our instruments, starting with their purpose and values and building a bridge to connect that to how do we live those values and what's going to lead us forward. Um, so they describe what they want. You can see this is actually from the last time I did one of these sessions. I think there were 24 leaders in the room. So there should be about 44 votes here. And you can see the blue, what they pluses, what they voted for, and what they voted against, what we don't want. I've done this probably over 250 times with organizations, and the consistency is shocking. Their positive votes will end up on the constructive styles, and vice versa, with almost no exceptions. And by the way, this is particularly powerful if you do it with two groups, right? As I described earlier, one leadership team describing what behavior is going to help our performance, and the other team describing what behavior is consistent with our values. What you'll find is both teams will have voted for and against the same behaviors, which really helps them to recognize that, hey, our values are right. What we're talking about in our values are the things that will help our people to perform effectively. And now we have a concept of and a language of what those behaviors really are. Very, very powerful step, very simple exercise, tremendously helpful. Now, in the case of this client that we're going to look at, they had already completed other instruments like the OCI ideal and the OCI current. For those of you who are accredited, you might be asking, why did you have them do the wall chart exercise describing what's preferred and versus what's not, what's ideal or not, when we already have the OCI ideal? That is true, but I find it to be the experience of going through this and answering it, and that exercise is a real eye opener and bridges really nicely to their ideal profile, which will be consistent with that description. So this is the client's ideal culture profile. Of course, we can see, yes, in fact, they did describe when they completed the OCI ideal in detail, all of those constructive styles that they want. You also see a bit of oppositional behavior. I really, unfortunately, today don't have the time to get into that, but this is something we very frequently see. What we're talking about are, a bit of a description of valuing defensive behavior. Interestingly, though, that description differs across the world based on societal values. So we have, and maybe in the next roundtable, I'll bring up our content and how these patterns correlate to other models like Hofstede's research on the difference in societal values around the world. But in any case, the point is that when you ask people what should be going on in your organization, you're asking a values based question, and the answer to that question will differ around the world. Interestingly, it doesn't really differ in terms of the constructive styles. Those are globally valued. And in fact, I can show you a global ideal profile that Human Synergistics has recently created with data from all around the world. I can also show you profiles from individual countries and societal regions, and you'll see that those values do shift. In any case, if you're living within Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, this profile is very much the sort of thing that your leaders and people in the organization will describe as being ideal, and that's great. Okay. So once they have some clarity on that ideal and where we're going, then I try to put this into the context of the broader how culture works model. I like to do this using Dr. Cook's original presentation, so thank you to him for that. And that is, as you can see on the slide, it's titled How Culture is Supposed to Work. Not really how it does, but how we, many times we find we leaders and organizations believe culture works. So let me try to describe this. On the far left, you're seeing the client's ideal profile. That's what they just, right? Your OCI ideal, what we want taking place in this business. The idea is then that we will communicate that in our mission and philosophy statement, communicating to our people that we value goal orientation and creativity and everybody's efforts counts and we want collaboration and all those good things. And if we do that and communicate that, then people, you can see the next section in the model, people will hear the message and they will do that. And that's why you're seeing the same profile, right? We're creating our value, but we're telling our people what the values are. They should hear that and act on that. And if they do, then we'll have a nice, constructive, high performing culture with very positive performance and well being. Unfortunately, this is not the whole picture. Um, the when we look in organizations using the OCI current, what we find is that there is a gap. And again, this is all real data. So in this case, while we want that nice blue profile on the left, yes, with the oppositional behavior, we're actually creating and have currently on the right something that looks and feels very, very different. And on the far right, you can see these are outcome criteria, measurements of psychological well-being of their people, like engagement, satisfaction, motivation, and performance criteria as well. And you can see those are trending negatively as a result, unfortunately, of the primarily defensive current culture. So the question is, why is this, right? Why is there a difference when we are clearly telling our people we value these constructive patterns and behaviors? Why are we getting something else? And that allows us to then introduce the final piece of the model there in the middle, which are, again, is organizational climate. I talked about this earlier today, so I'll keep this short. But again, these are those structures and systems that we've designed in the organization that are influencing the behavior of our people. So we can see that wonderful ideal on the left. And yes, we are communicating that in our mission and values, but unfortunately, we're doing things like designing goals and setting goals and designing jobs in ways that do not encourage and facilitate and enable that kind of behavior that we said we wanted, and instead are encouraging other patterns and norms, which is exactly what we're seeing in the current culture, which is playing out and having the consequences that we're seeing on the far right hand side. Okay. Now, when we think about moving forward to try to close this gap and move towards our ideal, then we need to leverage things within our organization's climate. We have to do something different here if we're going to expect people to approach their work and work together in new and improved ways. So then I have this little question to the leaders. In this case, for those of you who are accredited, you'll get this. This client did not use OEI to measure all of the climate factors. They really just used OCI current and ideal. But then they also used LSI to measure the behavior of their individual leaders. So to connect those dots for them, now I've introduced the full model. The next point is, of all of those 31 things in the organization's climate that we know and measure influence how people behave, like how jobs are designed, how goals are set, how communication structures are carried out, how authority is distributed, and so on. Which one is the most powerful? And a fun little exercise for them, and hopefully they get to recognize the point that it is leadership. And we can show this within data quite consistently, and we do measure aspects of leaders within climate. And those factors of leadership tend to be the most influential and powerful aspects of the organization's climate in driving culture, which is exactly why you've likely heard that organizational culture is driven and primarily influenced by leaders. And that's absolutely true. And we can measure and demonstrate that. In any case, if we understand that leaders are driving culture, we are also recognizing that if we want this culture to change, leaders need to take some responsibility and take the first steps. Now, what I'm doing, what I just added is what we call a composite profile. So let me go backwards one slide so this isn't too confusing. Within that last box of leadership, one aspect of leadership that very much influences culture, obviously, is leadership behavior. How I behave as a leader sets a standard, serves as a role model to others, and for better or worse, people tend to adopt the behaviors that they observe in their leaders and act on them themselves. And so when we go into their leadership team, and we did this with the top, I think, 25 or 30 leaders, and we measure individually how each leader is currently behaving in the organization, and then merge that data together into one composite profile. That's the profile that we have. If you can see my cursor, it's the second profile in the line in the place of climate. That is the combined pattern of the behavior within the leadership team. And it sets a standard, and you're seeing it in the current culture. Those are different profiles. One is leader behavior, and the other is organizational culture across thousands of people. Why are they so similar? Well, for two reasons. One, the culture influences the leaders, especially as they've been moving up through the hierarchical levels of the organization over their last 10 years in the organization or whatever it's been. Their behavior has systemically been reinforced and encouraged based on the organization's culture, the norms here. And therefore, leaders, when they get to those senior levels, have adapted the patterns that the organization has encouraged in its culture. Secondarily, then, the fact that the leaders are behaving in that way continues to drive the culture in that direction. And you get this very powerful reinforcing cycle where leaders drive culture and the culture reinforces that within leaders and members as they move up. However, the key thing to keep in mind here is that if we want this to change, it only can change in one place. The culture will not change itself. However, leaders can change. They can do something differently, and that's where the change needs to happen. So I find that to be a very helpful and powerful message. Sometimes I like to tell leaders at this point that, look, we need to recognize that you now are sort of at a fork in the road. Now that you have seen this, we've measured this, and you understand this, you have a decision to make as a leader or as a leadership team. You really ultimately can only do one of two things. You can either get this message and learn from it and do something about it and create something more positive, do something different to lead your business forward, or you can literally basically do nothing and continue to reinforce the current state that is having these consequences for your people. And again, if we want to talk about where we lose money and costs, it's in those things on the right hand side, like our people leaving the organization, being demotivated, dissatisfied, disengaged, not serving customers, wasting time. That's where you're losing the money. It's it's not on the tools and measuring this in the first place. It's certainly not in investing to change it and improve it. The where you lose money is by continuing to reinforce the same counterproductive behaviors that are costing you and failing to develop new, more positive patterns to guide your organization forward. That's the choice that the leadership team has. Hopefully, they take the choice to act and move in a positive direction. And that's my final point on this slide. I believe to change culture, we as leaders need to take the first step, take responsibility, and break that cycle. And in many ways, really only people in leadership positions can. There's so much more to culture development than just that, but that is sort of the initial steps of starting with the purpose and why, and building the bridge to understanding how what we want to achieve is facilitated through certain patterns of behavior. And we can not only measure those patterns in the organization, but more importantly, we can develop them moving forward to promote the performance and well-being in our people and teams and throughout the organization to truly create a more positive and sustainable and effective organization. So I hope that's helpful and give some kind of concepts in how to introduce. As you see, I did that in a half a day. It doesn't take all that much time, and you really do get a lot of important key concepts across, and you really get leaders to the point where they're ready to act. So it's exciting work. If you need any help with that or any questions, or if you're accredited and would like for me to do that kind of session with a client of yours, very happy to do that. Whatever helps. Keep in mind the purpose of human synergistics is to change the world one organization at a time to create that positive change. We can't do that alone, and we can't do that by our tools alone. They're great instruments, but they don't create change unless we do something with them and act upon that learning. So anything we can do to help facilitate that positive journey is very much part of what I help to contribute to. So thank you so much for the time today. That is our 3 hours. I hope this has been helpful and has shared information that you can learn from, or your clients as well, to help create that positive change for you and your clients. Very good. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.